Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton, here with Brandon. We said at the end of the last episode that there was going to be more to talk about today, and there is more to talk about today. Let's get into it. First of all, Springfest is over. All of the Springfest events have concluded, and we have data for almost all of them. We're still waiting on some results. We have data for the Mexico regional that we didn't have last time. We'll start there. Fate, MTI, and Slime Pants Wind winning that one, followed by Hololive, Slime, Kaguya, Gurren Lagann, ReZero, and then Goblin Slayer, Dal, Bangju. This wasn't a small regional, it was a 42-team regional, and yet despite that, we see a couple of definite outsiders getting tops, specifically Gurren Lagann and ReZero, both of which got their first tops of the season this weekend. We only have 3 of the other top 8 teams for Mexico. We see some Ruby, some MTI, mostly the usual suspects there. In London, some more outsiders. Kaguya, Ruby, and MTI take first, but in second place we have 7 Deadly Sins, MTI, and Kantai Collection, the second top of the season for both SDS and KC, followed by MTI, Sword Art Bang Dream, and then MTI, Fate, Ruby. Again, 33-team regional, not a small regional, but these European regionals have been very interesting. You'll just see some random stuff, it seems, find its way into top 8. But obviously, congrats to everyone involved in that regional as well. Finally, in Manila, in the Philippines, Bang Dream Hololive MTI takes the top spot, followed by Hololive Kaguya Sunshine, Hololive Dal Bang Dream, and Bang Dream Dal Hololive rounding out the top 4. So a lot of the stuff that we've come to see, and if you look further down, you see even more Love Life Sunshine, MTI, Hololive, just the stuff that we know already. So the Philippines regional was very much a meta-focused regional. A lot of really good decks there. The Australia regional, Bang Dream MTI Hololive, Bang Dream Ruby Hololive, Beaufort MTI Hololive, and Love Life Sunshine Hololive MTI. So Hololive on all 4 top 4 teams in Australia, with 3 MTIs and a couple of Bang Dreams as well. Once again, congratulations to everyone who got a top at these events. Moving on to the table, this is the good stuff. So here is the table. This is basically it. We're still missing one from Mexico, but as it stands, MTI still on top. Almost 2/3 of all teams had one. Hololive close behind. It's taken a chunk out of MTI's representation rate and has quickly moved up in the table as well. Bang Dream falling behind at nearly 40%, with Slime and Ruby both taking up about a quarter of team slots. These guys clearly going 1-2. What else do you see on this table, Brandon, that strikes you as interesting?
The further we go down the table, the more varied the decks look. Like MTI, we have essentially the majority of that is one deck, right? There's a couple of different builds, like the Choice Pants build, but for the majority of MTI, you're looking at that 8 standby build. Hololive is pretty varied as to what it actually topped with it. Majority of those kind of being the Ruxia or Marine top end. The further you go down, Bang Dream, the majority of them running that Chew package to get that kind of mid-game power defensively, as well as hexproof. So being able to kind of maintain and grasp board there. Slime, you have those 3 different builds. Ruby varies builds as well. The builds keep spreading out what those sets look like. The further we get away from the top, there's a couple of lone exceptions that sneak their way in here. Kaguya is pretty all consistently one deck. Love Life Sunshine is pretty consistently one deck, but the rest of them are kind of just that variance as we go through.
Yeah, almost every set in the top 10 has at least a couple different ways that it can be constructed, even if it's working towards a similar package, like, as you mentioned, the Chew package in Bang Dream. The way that you get there is a little different sometimes, but most of these decks even have multiple top ends that you could be considering as well. So, yeah, there's a lot of variance in these top 10. It's almost the opposite as you get into the second group there, right? Because then you have things like Adventure Time, Goblin Slayer, AOT, they all have more one kind of dominant build that people tend to go towards, but They're all older sets, and, you know, their deck is just whichever one happened to, still remain at least somewhat relevant going into all of this new stuff that we've had over the past couple of years that's really pushed the power threshold at the competitive tables. Getting their first tops this last weekend, Kill la Kill, Gurren Lagann, and Persona 5, as well as ReZero getting the 2. So we end up with 30 different sets, 30 different titles getting their tops. I don't know if that speaks to the diversity of the meta, because it's very, very top heavy. Like, you look at the top 5 versus everybody else, and there really isn't that much of a comparison. Like, it was MTI, Hololive, and something else, usually Bang Dream. That was what usually won these tournaments. So given all of that, based on this data, but also just some analysis from things that you can't really see in that table, we put together a tier list. And I think the best way to describe this list is it's how things are right now, based on how things did at Springfest. This is not an indication of where things are going in the next couple of months. Like, the next couple of months are obviously going to be very interesting. A lot of things could potentially change. But this is based on how things performed at Springfest. If you were preparing for a tournament tomorrow, I think this is where things kind of coalesce. And you can divide them basically into 4 tiers, with like an additional slot for things that were just intentionally anti-meta. But let's start at the top. No debates, right? The top 3 sets in the meta right now are MTI, Hololive, and Bang Dream. There's no real question about it. We split up the Hololives because the Rushia and Marine packages are pretty different. Bang Dream, you're almost always playing into Chu2, even if you're playing into different top ends, different level 1 combos. The Chu2 engine kind of brings Bang Dream all together to a certain extent. So that's why we decided to keep that together. But yeah, these are the top 3 sets. Like, I just don't think there's any real debate about that.
As we go look at the next tier down, we did split slime up just to recognize that there are 3 different unique slime builds, alongside then Ruby and Love Live Sunshine that also kind of really were that next like step down in terms of representation, as well as tops, depending on the low amounts of information that we know about like representation and making into top cut.
Yeah, and Slime and Ruby, they're 4 and 5 in terms of like tops based on number of sets. Based on that, it makes sense to put them in this tier. Slime, as you mentioned, they have 3 different builds, and those 3 builds basically evenly split all of Slime's tops. Like, out of the 28, like, they all got like 8 or 9. It's very interesting how close all 3 of these were in terms of their presence in top 8. And of course, they're keeping each other out of top 8 because you aren't allowed to have more than 1 slime in a team. So it made sense to keep them on this tier, all 3 decks individually. If they had been in different sets, we'd probably be able to get a better look at, how they were playing into the meta broadly, maybe be able to move, up or down depending on how they were doing in a context where they didn't have to compete with each other. But based on how they performed and how evenly they seemed to perform alongside each other, it made sense to put all 3 of them here in this tier. Ruby, the salvage standby, seems to have done a little better than 8 standby. I'm still partial to the 8 standby personally, but based on the data, it looks like more people were on salvage standby, and it got a few more tops than the 8 standby Ruby stuff. Love Live Sunshine, we kind of made a call on this one because there's just less Sunshine running around. Sunshine's conversion rate was certainly much higher than some of the other stuff that's above it on this chart.
Based on the numbers that we've seen for total representation.
Right, and obviously those numbers are kind of scattered. They're all over the place. There's nothing coherent, or else obviously we would have collected it and presented it here. But based on, like, as much of that data as we can scrape together based on, the few places that did keep track of representation, the people that we asked at different events, it seems that Love Live Sunshine's representation was much lower, but its conversion rate was much higher, which is why it still ends up on this second tier. it's still good. Like, just extra burns for the entire second half of the game is still a very viable strategy. Moving into the third tier, we already kind of talked about Ruby. Kaguya, the ban hurt. The ban really hurt Kaguya, but it still finished 6th overall in terms of total representation on teams. About 1/6 of all top 8 teams had Kaguya. So it showed up in more events than not. Seems to be pretty consistently standby salvage still.
Yeah, the question is not what does the build look like regarding standby and salvage. It's the question of how many standby are they running. It did well, and the representation data, again, the conversion rate's still really good for Kaguya, despite the ban. It was not nearly as good as, like, Love Live Sunshine.
Right, and that's why it's here on the third tier. Same with Dao. Like, Dao, its representation was really hit by its bans, but there were some people who tried to sort it out, leaning more into the choice package, in particular at level 1, which makes a lot of sense. The split between the standby and choice top ends was pretty even. So again, like, they're kind of knocking each other out to a certain extent. So we could either like leave them down further as individuals, or we could just go, hey, Dal in general seems to be doing this no matter what Dal you play. So that's how it ends up here. Kind of mid-tier in terms of like a competitive environment. Like, you can still play Dal in a competitive space and do well, but it's not quite as powerful as the top tier stuff, especially now that it's been so heavily hit by the ban hammer. MTI Choice Pants. This is an interesting one. We have it on the third tier specifically because we know it's good. We know it's good. It's very playable. But its representation rate was incredibly small because its 8 standby counterpart is just that much better. If you're playing MTI at a competitive event, you're almost always playing 8 standby just because of how powerful it is. And that meant that people just weren't on Choice Pants, which is in and of itself a good deck. So more or less, like, because there isn't a ton of data, we have it here on the third tier, easily could be promoted to the second tier. It literally isn't being played because of how the Springfest rules work. You're not allowed to have multiple MTIs on a team. I think if you were, we would have seen a lot more of Choice Pants, and it very likely would have ended up higher on this list.
Yeah, having to compete with the 8 standby build for representation, I think, is what brought it down. 8 standby being the big standby board on field, it would give way to its counterpart just because that deck can effectively deny specific decks from even like playing the game.
Next, we're talking about Fate. 8 Salvage Fate did the best out of any of the Fates. Like, the majority of the 16 tops that the Fate series got was 8 Salvage. 8 Salvage is alright. Like, I keep going back and forth on Fate, right? Like, as the meta moves in different directions, being a Fate player is just like riding the waves. 8 plussing Fate is as well positioned as it has been since Dal came out. I don't think it's ever going to climb any higher than this, especially like as it ages, because we're not going to get any more support for it unless something ridiculous happens. But the salvage top end, in particular, the one with Saber, like, I think the Icy Tail is fine, but I think the Saber top end is the way to go with this, because you functionally have 2 different salvage top ends you're allowed to use. It's also got that green anti-standby tech that more people are using, right, to kind of give it a fighting chance against big boards, because it takes traits off of your opponent's big stuff and lets you get over it with your level 1 combo and your level 2. So, like, and Fate still has all these synergy pieces, right? Like, it still has an on-play Azusa. It still has, one of the best Amagis in any set. It still has the free refresh. It still has an oversized drop search. Like, it has all these tools, the Shiro Encore. Fate will never be bad again, I don't think. It's still not great, but it's playable. And I think that's about where it's going to cap for the time being. I still think the Pants level 1 is better, but I recognize why people would rather be in red, like, because there's so many good red pieces, like that Amagi, like the free refresh. So I get why people are on Salvage at 1. Fate's in a weird spot, but I think it's finally starting to coalesce into, it's alright.
Having some of those tech pieces to play into some of those bigger matchups, specifically like that trait removal, because a lot of the cards in the tiers above it rely on a single trait, it allows it to be able to kind of step in and kind of win board in ways that it wasn't able to do versus Dal. Specifically because Dal has 2 traits that it relies on, and a lot of its 8 standby counterparts have both of those traits. So it doesn't actually, so that trait counter didn't affect Dal when Dal was in the prime.
Yeah, we've talked about like the Dal ban more than anybody helped Fate and Ruby, and I think we saw that in Springfest, both of them doing better than they had done in previous events, because the thing that hurt them the most wasn't present. But I also think that Fate, because it's got this massive toolbox, is maybe more adaptable than I initially gave it credit for, back when it was really struggling under Data Live. Because it has enough pieces where it can kind of put something together, right? Fate has so many cards because it has so many sets and enough powerful and unique profiles that you can build a Fate deck that's kind of wonky, but still quite playable because it deals with what something does. Is there a Fate list that's going to put all those things together and be able to run them all coherently at, the singles regional level? I don't think, not of the top tier sense, but Fate's interesting. Fate remains interesting, and I'm glad to see that it's still, at least somewhat viable. It's a weird set for sure, just because of all of its diverse profiles and different ways it can be constructed. Moving down to the next tier, we're talking about the Party Crashers. Beaufry exists to nuke standby boards. SAO 8 Wind gets rid of standby targets with its basically wind trigger on demand kind of effects.
Yeah, and that doesn't just affect standby, it also affects anything that's trying to keep board, which a lot of the decks that we see up here are either standby based or have some kind of board based presence. So being able to remove characters from board allows those sets to be able to do well. So it makes sense why they were here and showed up often, because it was the anti-meta, right? It was the anti-board decks that were able to make their way through. So that's why we gave it its own tier.
Right.
Here, just so that way we can separate, hey, look, that's why these decks did well, is because we're in a very heavily board-based thing.
Yeah, like Beaufry's going to do a whole lot better against 8 standby slime than it is 8 choice slime. Just because that's what it's built to deal with. So putting it in a tier just didn't feel right because it's so matchup dependent. It's a meta call. If you're playing these two, you are planning on facing a lot of standby and oversized early play stuff. And it's a good bet. So you can take this to a regional level event and, get wins, because these decks at the top tables running these massive standby packages and early plays, they don't really have anything to deal with something that's just going to remove them over and over. And then finally, this bottom tier, to say it's bottom tier isn't entirely fair, because there are obviously so many decks that are below it. Like, there are tons of decks on the data sheet that didn't make it here. These are the ones that we kind of picked out as being like, they're interesting. They're still more interesting. Like, some of these sets that got a handful of tops, it's like, okay, fine. Like, some sets got carried in certain times. Like, we're getting into the space where, like, most of these decks have, like, maybe a half a dozen tops, with one notable exception, which we will get to.
Yeah, we're just highlighting some of the ones that did not make it into those previous categories, ones that had been higher on those ratings but now have begun to fall off some.
Or at the very least, like, still, they have something that makes them interesting. Still.
Sure. I mean, like, in regards of representation of multiple people.
So we'll start with quintuplets, because quintuplets actually, like, I'm sure there's got to be a quintuplets player who's watching this going, you got 14 tops, it finished in the top 10, why is it down here? Frankly, it's because of where it got its tops. Most of its tops came in really small tournaments. It topped 4 times at the 12-team tournament in Hungary. It topped 4 times at the 8-team tournament in Spain. Like, set's not bad. Deck isn't bad, but it got so much of its top 8 representation at smaller events where it wasn't playing into as much stuff. Like, 4 of its top 8s were literally it showed up at an event with only 8 teams. So that's what's reflected here. It's not like a diss at quintuplets. Quintuplets is fine. Like, it's not a bad set, but it definitely was way overrepresented.
And that's not to say that it didn't top at larger events either. It just wasn't as it got the more tops that it got were in smaller events.
Its representation rate at top events was much, much smaller. Like, it got 8 of its tops at 2 events where there were a total of 20 teams. One of those events was the Hungary event where there was no MTI. As far as the rest of this, like, Adventure Time still has one of the best top ends in Weiss. Like, it's still got a really good top end. It's one of the best English top ends. Its representation rate is also deeply affected by the number of tournaments it wasn't allowed to be at. So, yes, it only got 4 tops, but it wasn't allowed to be at, like, 5 tournaments. So, I think it's worth noting that its representation rate, 1 out of every 20 or so teams in a top 8 had an Adventure Time. So, like, Adventure Time is something that if you're playing into it, you need to know what it does. It's not just a pile of cards. AOT, because the top end is still good, if it's playing into something that it can get reverses against at 1, then it's still going to get its Aaron pluses. Like, super inconsistent, very matchup dependent, like, really struggles with standby unless it hits its win triggers, but still viable, can do some things. Same with Konosuba, like, Fumio Burn 5 is still a way to win games. Like, there's no way of getting around that. Like, that's tough.
And if you don't have removal, having that Obero combo at 1.
Yeah, the zombie that is the Obero combo continues to technically exist because there are a few decks that can't deal with it. So, yeah, so Konosuba, like, it's still present. Sword Art, it can call out some pieces and it has some support. And Seven Deadly Sins, it can still shut off certain top ends, right? Like, it still gets really freaking huge on board. And if you don't have good removal, Mushoku Tensei, then you can really struggle to deal with SDS because you're not getting your burns off. And you're also struggling to get over this or remove it from field. So, certain matchups, SDS is quite good. A lot of matchups, SDS is not very good just because of how much removal there is.
Also, over this past weekend was Anime Expo, where we expected to get some kind of announcement as to what was going to come next, or confirmation of things that we already got. In between the last Clock Talk and this one, we did get information about Dragon Maid. We're getting Dragon Maid in English. That has been confirmed.
I am a fool. I was not a believer. I failed to keep the faith. And I've never been so happy to be so wrong. We're getting Maid Dragon. I really thought that Bushiroad was going to mess with us. I really thought that they were going to do it.
That's going to be in November. They had a panel at the event. At that panel, they did not announce anything else that was going to be coming out to English. There was a PR card and announcements around the panel itself. Billboard signs saying, hey, look, Chainsaw Man is coming to Weiss. At the panel for the Chainsaw anime, they did announce that it was going to be coming to English Weiss. We did get an English promo that is just another vanilla card. JP announced it for 2023. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that in 2023 as well.
Yeah, we're probably looking at about a year from now, probably sometime next summer. Confirmation of Buzzsaw Louie the anime in 2023.
We were hoping that we would get information about Seven Deadly Sins 2 and the release for that, expecting that to come out in December. We did not get any information about that. We did, however, in the midst of that panel, receive a spoiler for one of the cards for Attack on Titan final season, one of the Levi cards. And what's notable about that specifically, and worth bringing up here, is that that Levi card had both the new trait and the old core trait on it. So that it seems that there will be some cards that will not be trait locked into the new stuff, but will have both the new trait and the old trait on it. So there may be some cards from set 3 that are interactable with some of the old stuff from set 2. We know the PRs that were going to come out with the set had the old core trait. We saw some of the stuff from the trial deck that did not. So it was unconfirmed as to whether or not that was going to happen. With that, we've seen now this one card with that available. So at least some of the cards should have the core trait on it.
Yeah, and I think that when we saw the original Anime Expo promo that did not have the core trait, especially because I'm pretty sure the only cards that we had seen before were PRs. And you frankly can't go off of PRs when you're planning on, what a future set is going to have. So, not only to see core traits show up again, but also on a good card, like this is a good Ricky profile, I think indicates that they're at least not going to go completely away from it. How much of the set's going to have the core trait? Don't know. But at the very least, it means that there will be some support for the old core trait package. And we'll see what they do with it. So yeah, as of now, this is the English release schedule. Danmachi and Tokyo Revengers in July, followed by Quintuplets 2 in August. AOT 3 and the Hololive Premium Booster will both come out in September. Bunny Girl Senpai 2 and Saikano both expected in October. Dragon Maid in November. And SDS 2 with an as yet unannounced date. Unless Chainsaw Man is a simultaneous English and JP release, which it definitely could be, we expect Chainsaw Man to make it to English but not be here until mid-2023. So that's it for us. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back on Thursday. We'll be talking about 5 cards, 5 minutes for Tokyo Revengers. The following Tuesday, more Weiss 101. And a week from Thursday, gameplay. In 2 weeks, another Clock Talk. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And have a good one.
We'll see you then.